this. All right, cool. All right, well, thank you guys for coming. This is fantastic to see so many people here. Basically, what I wanted to talk to you all today is pretty much about the body's stress response. Now, it goes without saying that we're probably more stressed out than we've ever been before in just about any other period of human history. And over the course of this talk, we're going to be going into some of the common reasons why that is. So things that are physical, psychological, even environmental stresses, things that you may not have even realized or maybe perhaps even considered as a stressor before. And we're also going to go into a little bit of the endocrinology. Okay, so I'm going to go through that and keep it as simple as we possibly can. But the reason for that is because it's very important to understand, A, what's actually happening in your body, how that feedback mechanism works, and therefore it'll actually help you further understand the gravity of what can actually happen when the stress response is let go out of control. Because the first thing people need to get, and it's the most important thing, is that commonly in a lot of the literature, whenever if you go online and you Google cortisol, basically everyone's there and it's all doom and gloom, and it's like, oh my God, we're gonna die, and it's gonna basically be the end of us. But it's not all bad. If you didn't have cortisol, you wouldn't have energy, okay? The problem is not cortisol, it's the problem when it's too high over long periods of time, okay? So what it is, essentially, cortisol is a stress hormone that is actually part of the body's fight or flight response. And its whole purpose is to give you energy, okay? And the way that it does that is by increasing adrenaline and by also increasing your blood sugar, okay? Because from there, why is that even happening? Because your body, if it's in a state of panic where you're over into survival mode, you're either going to hunt or be hunted, you need to be able to react, and you need energy to be able to do that, all right? But after that initial trigger, your body will then be able to calm itself down and restore yourself back to what's called allostasis or balance, okay? And as I was just piggybacking on what we were saying earlier, it's not so much that's problematic, it's when you're overloading your body over time so much so that that set point is then, it's kind of like if you have an elastic band and you stretch it, you let it go and it gets snapped back into place, okay? But if you were to then take that elastic band and stretch it and pin one side to each side of this wall, and then let it go, it's going to lose its elasticity over time. That more or less is a pretty accurate analogy of what's actually happening to your body, okay? Now, just a little bit of background about myself. Okay, so I've been in the industry for about 6 years now, and in my time, I predominantly worked with what I call general population, which is people like yourselves, and the predominant basis of my clientele have usually been, people that work 9-to-5 jobs, busy corporates, etc. And it's really interesting because in my experience, I've had people who've been shift workers, I've had people who have been CEOs, executives, people from all walks of life, all different types of job positions, and it's very interesting to see how stress affects individuals differently. And I'll give you an example of myself. So, for myself personally, about just over 12 months ago, I said I wanted to do a competition, okay? Leading up to that, before I even embarked on any training or nutritional protocol, I went and got a base set of bloods done, okay? Now, the funny thing is that this is obviously me in competition phase, okay, after about 6 months of training. But prior to that, I was probably we'd probably say sitting about 12 or 13% body fat. I wasn't technically overweight, but I was insulin resistant. So when I actually was in the GP's office and we were going over my bloods, he was like, well, did you know that you're actually pre-diabetic? And that completely blew me away, okay? Because looking at me, you wouldn't think that I was by the typical standard of what we tend to think someone who is pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetes would look like. But the reason why that was because my stress levels were completely out of control. I was waking up at 5 a.m. every morning, going to bed at about 10 o'clock every night, 10:30, waking up multiple times. I had poor sleep, I had gut issues, I had brain fog. I would consistently be forgetting things in the middle of what I was talking about. And these are things that I see in people all the time. And at the time I was going through all this and I'm like, I'm fine. You know what I mean? I'm at work and I'm doing these long hours, and by our common kind of ideal concept of what constitutes success, I actually thought I was pretty successful. even though I had no work-life balance and I was doing 40 sessions a week, I was just like, yeah, man, this is cool, I'm killing it. But not really. Like that's not sustainable. But then you need to look at that and you need to think, how many people do you know live like that and they think that that is sustainable? Your body's only going to be able to take so much of that. And you might be good at the beginning, like I was fine at the beginning, but like we're saying, that elastic band that loses its elasticity, it's over time, things start to break down and things start to go wrong. Now, these photos here, the one on the left and the one on the right, are about 7 months apart, 6 months apart, roughly. And as you can see here, leading up to my last show, very, very small, very flat, not a lot of abdominal definition. Cortisol's increasing water retention. As a result, I couldn't actually load any carbohydrates onto the stage. Otherwise, if I did, my gut would distend, no joke, about this far. I literally looked like I was about 9 months pregnant. All of these things were being brought on by just the acute stresses that I had in my life, then being compounded with the stress of high frequency, high volume training and also an extreme caloric deficit, okay? Which is something that people commonly do because they don't understand that caloric restriction and training is actually another stressor. But in between here and here, okay, a lot of things changed. I pulled back on a lot of the sessions that I was doing, changed my nutrition up, started addressing my gut, started basically doing more meditation, more yoga type activities, and as you can see, the changes in body composition are dramatic, okay? And that's just a short example of how stress affects everybody differently. But now let's go into some of the mechanisms of what the stress response is and how you can actually modify that. So stress in the 21st century, it's important to know that stress affects every single cell in your body because the stress itself is a hormone and every cell in your body has receptors for hormones. So everything from your neurological function, muscle function, endocrine function, everything is being responsive to fluctuations in cortisol and everything operates on a feedback loop. Okay, so if you look at all of these things here, these are things that I probably commonly see in people the most across the board, particularly things like low energy, chronic fatigue, mood, cognitive issues, and particularly gut issues. Very, very common. All right. But now we need to actually look at what a stressor actually is. So as I was saying before, like that is just my observation. Is that like that's not based on anything. That's just my observation. Is that my experience, I would just say that people are now the more stressed that they've ever been before in any period of human history. We're going to look at the reasons why, but one of the biggest reasons why people are stressed, I find, is more so psychological than anything. And one of the biggest stresses for people is financial stress. And this was actually found in the Australian Psychological Study Survey. And workplace stresses, people being unhappy with their jobs. Okay, like how many people here have had a rough day at work, then they've gone home, they're stressed out about it because they've got anxiety, they may not be taking their work home, but they're obsessing about it and they can't sleep at night. This is very, very common. And also another thing that's very important to notice is the way that stress actually affects individuals. When you actually look at the research, women are usually twice as likely to actually suffer anxiety and depression related to stress. And we're going to actually look at that in a separate slide as to the reasons why. But definitely, I have even seen personally that I tend to find that women, as opposed to men, tend to actually internalize their stresses a lot more. So if we were, for example, to look at, there was research that was done where they actually looked at couples in a heterosexual relationship where they had workplace stresses at home, and they actually found that the way that men deal with stress is tend to become more egocentric and actually less responsive to an opposite person, their partner's feelings, and tend to block it out, shut it out, and then numb and usually self-medicate. Whereas women tend to actually take that on, absorb it, internalize it, because it tends to come down to, it's hypothesized that it's more of a maternal instinct that tends to come from almost like a way that we've biologically evolved as humans, that men tend to go out basically and go on the hunt, whereas women would be the more protective nurturers, okay? Just quickly, we're going to go into, when you're actually talking to someone who's maybe a health professional, if you feel you might have a cortisol issue, this is what they're going to basically refer back to, which is a HPA axis, which stands for your hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland, which is basically, think of it like a feedback loop, okay? So how I was saying before that your body, everything in your body talks to one another. So in a nutshell, okay, if you're walking out in nature, and we're going to look at this as kind of from a survival aspect, okay? If you're out in nature and you see a bear, Okay, brain instantly. Okay, so warning signs, warning bells start going off. All right. Now from there, what your brain is doing is it's sending a message to your pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is then passing on the message to your adrenal glands to say, hey, we've got a threat here. We need to react, either fight or flight. And then that's when you start actually producing cortisol and adrenaline, and that's from where pretty much your get up and go is going to come from. Okay. So this is why, for example, too, when people are chronically stressed or under pressure and anxiety, they'll usually commonly wake up with very low morning energy, because cortisol is like your body's alarm clock. If you have low morning cortisol, you're going to be finding that you're going to be hitting the snooze button multiple times, and you're basically going to be finding it very hard to get out of bed. These people also tend to be the types of people who usually say, oh, they need to have their coffee first thing in the morning before they actually feel like they have any type of get up and go. Purely because the caffeine is actually putting the boot into their adrenal glands for them and actually bringing up their cortisol to where that actually needs to be for them to actually feel like they have any certain amount of energy. Okay? So, as I said before, short term, it's fine. Okay? As long as your body can recover and bring itself back to that set point. But it's over time when it's prolonged. Okay? That's when it becomes problematic. So in terms of what actually happens in the body, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, okay, because I don't want to lose any of you, but I just want you to get an overview of what's actually happening. So we've already talked about how from here your brain's actually communicating with your adrenal glands, okay, which are actually little pyramid glands that sit atop of your kidneys. All right. Now, one of the first things that cortisol is going to do is it's actually going to flood the bloodstream with sugar or glucose, okay, from the liver. All right. Why? To give you energy. All right. The next thing that it's going to do is it's also going to stop to minimize protein turnover, and then from there, that's going to basically, if you don't have enough amino acids that your body needs to regenerate and perform its function, it's going to grab it from the most bountiful source, which is going to be your muscle. Okay. And this is why cortisol gets its reputation as basically being a wear and tear hormone. Okay? It's not all bad, but as it's floating around, it is actually quite catabolic, and it will actually it's basically there to break the tissues down or to actually provide energy. So whether it's from the liver for glucose or from the muscle, etc. You're going to have your immune system activated, and the easiest way to explain this is kind of like, how do we say? It's like if you're in trouble, all right, and your body starts basically kicking in because it needs to act and react, your body actually doesn't really know what's happening, okay? You know what's happening because you're perceiving it as a threat, whether it's real or imagined, but your body internally doesn't know what's happening. So basically, it's like your brain at that point in time is like calling the fire brigade, the ambulance, and the police service all at once to go rushing to the scene, okay? Your police, the police is kind of like your adrenaline, okay? Because it's basically like the riot squad, ready to put up a defense. Then you've got the ambulance, which is kind of like the anti-inflammatory aspect of of cortisol, because it actually is anti-inflammatory, okay? So it's rushing out to try and put out the fire. And also you've got your immune system, which is also rushing onto the scene, because that is pretty much one of your first stages of defense, okay? And that's why people who actually have high levels of inflammation usually have high cortisol, and as a result, it actually will plummet their immune system over time, and you'll become more susceptible to things like colds, common flus, people that tend to get sick quite frequently, but also it takes them longer periods of time to actually recover because their immune system's suppressed, which was actually funnily enough, one of the other things that came up in my bloods when I got them screened. My immune system was just completely crashing, and even in like my first 2 or 3 months of my prep that I was doing, I would literally have a cold that seemed to linger for like 2 to 3 weeks at a time. I would get better, then I would get sick again, okay? Also, your heart rate increases, basically due to your adrenaline as well. So everything's being sped up, okay? Because it needs, and your energy is being mobilized. So this is your body demanding energy to attack, okay? To fight or flight. But then what's going to tend to happen over time? Well, those energy reserves are going to become depleted, because the energy is going to then need to come from somewhere. And then that's when we start getting into what people are talking about when they're referring to things like adrenal exhaustion and adrenal fatigue. Okay, so basically, like, your body just does not have the reserves that's required to actually provide energy. Therefore, you're not producing energy, and then people tend to crash and feel really flat and burnt out and tired. Okay. So now, we've discussed basically a very brief overview of what stress actually is. So now it's really important to try and look at what actually constitutes a stressor. Now, the things that I've actually put in bold here tend to be things that I personally tend to see the most. As you can see, we've got financial worries, there's relationship stress, sleep deprivation is a huge one because it tends to be a bit of a downward spiral. The more stressed out you are, the poorer you sleep, and then the more stressed out you are during the day as your stress resilience or your resilience to stress is actually reduced. Caloric restriction definitely will increase carbohydrates. Anyone who's ever done an extreme diet will definitely attest to that. Unhappiness at work, overtraining, food sensitivities also is a huge one. So when you're eating foods, for example, like it may be gluten, maybe dairy, it could be different for anyone. So everyone's intolerant to different things. I've had clients who've had food intolerance tests and they've been intolerant to things like avocados. And once they've taken them out, they've been like, oh my God, I feel so much better now. Because they're reducing all these foods that are actually chronically activating inflammation and increasing cortisol in the body. So that's a really big one. And also that's part of the reason why personally I don't really believe in flexible dieting or if it fits your macros. We're not going to go into that. It's great if you do. If it works for you, fine. Whatever works for you. Okay, great. But personally, if you're eating foods that are actually driving that kind of inflammatory shock in the body, especially if you're already not feeling 100%, it's really not going to help, especially if you're doing it on a daily basis, okay? And the other big one that I really want to point out, sugar and refined flour is like kind of like a no-brainer, but fear, okay? Fear, isolation, depression, and we're going to talk about this in kind of like the ways to overcome the stress response, but loneliness is huge. Feelings, like human beings are wired for connection, okay? We are hardwired for connection with each other, feeling valued, feeling worthy, okay, feelings of worthiness. When people don't have that, like seriously, like it's that isolation can actually wreak havoc on them in their psychological state. There was actually, there's a research, I can get it for you and I'll link you to it when I find it again, but they did a heart study on something like 11,000 patients, and they actually found that the feelings of loneliness and isolation were actually more damaging or had more cardiovascular ill effects than hypertension, which is high blood pressure, and smoking combined. So this is the kind of like stuff when I talk to people about it that sounds like a little bit woo-woo, like a little bit hippie-trippy, but it's actually big stuff, okay? Very big. Because you've got to remember is that your body, okay, whether you're being attacked by, okay, so whether you're on fire or you're imagining being on fire, okay, your body doesn't know the difference, okay? Your physiological response is going to be the same, okay? So taking responsibility for the way that you feel and being able to practice mindfulness and being present in that moment and actually cleansing our perceptions of the way we perceive things happening to us, it actually goes a long way in actually modulating that stress response. It's big stuff. So as we were talking about before a little bit earlier, I won't go too much into this, but I thought this would be really interesting for women in particular, especially how I was touching on earlier about how women actually tend to internalize their stresses a lot more. Women as well, you need to understand is that females are a lot more affected by cycles than men are, okay? And this is also going to influence the way that they feel, basically from month to month. And the one in the middle, which I was talking to you about, the stress response and the way it's different in men and women has been hypothesized to be the difference of the primitive male and female, and the men being fight or flight and the women being like tend and befriend. Okay, and that men tend to be more self-centered and egocentric than women, who actually tend to have more of present more of an emotional concern and more of a capacity or ability for empathy than the men do. So it's kind of like, it's funny, it's kind of like more or less that if you're having a disagreement and she's stressed out and she's blaming it on you, it's probably your fault, depending on what it is, to some degree, okay? All right, so now this seems like it's all doom and gloom, but we're going to start moving on to the strategy of how to actually overcome and actually optimize our body's physiology and psychology so that we actually are able to manage our stresses better. But this is important because you need to understand fully how it affects every single body system, okay? And that, because this is the thing, like when I sometimes talk to people about stress, it gets poo-pooed a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, it's not that big of a deal. I'm like, yeah, well, it can be. And everyone does respond differently. So cortisol is heavily catabolic, as I mentioned earlier. If you're not actually getting the amino acids in from your diet, and remember that it is going to shut down your, or impair greatly your body's ability to digest food. Like who finds as soon as they're stressed out, they lose their appetite? Straight up. You don't feel like eating, you're eating food, you're feeling like it's sitting in your gut for hours, okay? All right? And you tend to skip meals, etc. That is because cortisol is interfering with your digestion and the secretion of stomach acid, okay? So then you're not getting amino acids that are needed for repair and bodily function. It's going to take it from your muscle, all right? Then you're going to have problems with your immune system and your gut being activated. Now, when we talk about food intolerances as well, they can actually develop pretty quickly. So if you're under extreme acute or chronic stress, you can see symptoms of food intolerance developing in people in like 48 hours. Okay? And this is purely because the gut becomes permeable. So you've got to think about the lining of the gut pretty much becoming like Swiss cheese. All right? And then you've got and now I said you have your immune systems activated. So what's actually then happening is that you're not breaking down your food properly, then you've got all of this shit leaking from your digestion into your bloodstream in the form of endotoxins, partially digested proteins, and then it's kind of like your immune system is jumping in and becoming like your secondary digestive system to go around and attack and kill off all of this, these undigested food particles because it sees it as an invader. Okay? And this is all that also the beginning of, for a lot of people, of where like autoimmune diseases actually begin. Okay? All right, so also the next one, downregulation of metabolism, because cortisol actually interferes with the conversion of T4 to T3, which is actually your inactive to your active, okay, form of your body's thyroid hormone. That's pretty much like your body's thermostat. So that's going to dictate body temperature and how fast or slow you actually turn over energy at a cellular level, all right? So as soon as that slows down, fat loss, okay, is going to slow down with it, 100%. Because it's kind of like your body, because we're demanding energy all the time, because we're cranking and we're putting the boot into our adrenal glands to make cortisol, your body then is going to, as part of a negative feedback, is going to want to conserve energy any other way that it can. And the way that it's going to do that is by turning down the thermostat. Make sense? Okay? And also your heart's basically working harder. The hippocampus in the brain, which is responsible for memory, actually starts to shrink. So this is when people start developing things like memory loss. And cortisol is also notorious for brain fog as well. So where like you go home and you can't find your car keys, or I used to do this all the time. Like I would run late for clients because I would leave my house and in the afternoon, and then I would get down the street and I'd be like, shit, did I turn the oven off? Did I close the windows? And then then I would get anxious about it and I'd have to run back. But I was doing that like 4 times because my brain fog was just so bad, okay? And this is a really common thing, just that absent-mindedness or that forgetfulness, all right? All right, so after a while too, we're going to go into the mechanism about how it happens, but particularly in females and in women, a big indicator of adrenal exhaustion in early stages is, and men particularly too, but more so in women, is usually sex drive and libido. As soon as it crashes and it's like non-existent, you can be pretty certain that usually there's some type of adrenal stressor that's being related to that. Okay, so have you got a cortisol issue? The first thing to do, it's important, if you don't know if you do or not, you can kind of self-assess. These are pretty much like my basic ones that I would look at because they're the most simple ways that you can kind of assess for yourself. And if you find that you're ticking 2 or 3 of these issues, then you may not have a serious issue, but usually these are the indicators that you're at the beginning of some type of hypercortisolemia, which is like you're basically producing excess cortisol, okay? So the important thing about this, and when people talk about adrenal fatigue, etc., some people then argue that adrenal fatigue is not a thing, it's just HPA excess dysregulation, whatever. Okay, I'm just using that term because people can relate to it or understand it easier. The further that you go into it, or to adrenal exhaustion, the harder it is to pull yourself out of it. So if you're looking at this, and you're going, check, 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 okay? then my advice to you is definitely take on board some of the strategies that I'm going to give to you in a moment on how to actually manage these things, okay? But one of the big things that I find is usually the low morning energy. If you're waking up in the morning and you're just like slamming the alarm clock, you're dragging your ass out of bed, and you're finding it really hard to get going, that food cravings, the mood is huge because of the connection to your gut. And even like psychological stress will alter your gut bacteria, and then that will act, and most of your serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter for your brain, is produced in your gut, and that instantly is going to create sleep issues and disrupt your sleep cycle, and usually you're going to then feel kind of a little bit flat, a little bit down, a little bit depressed, okay? Very, very common. And increased fat storage around the abdominal cavity, okay? So like the belly fat, particularly in men, we tend to see this more. Now, believe it or not, body fat's actually pretty harmless. Initially, subcutaneous fat, this doesn't really do much. It's really just real estate for surplus energy, okay? It's like energy stores. But it's the visceral fat, the abdominal fat, that's the nasty shit. That is the shit that you do not want, okay? Because visceral fat is pretty much the fat that's surrounding all of your internal organs, and that stuff is basically metabolically active, and that's actually increasing what's called cytokines, which pretty much drive inflammation in the body, okay? So in talking, we are a society that's becoming obsessed with leanness, but in terms of the actual health risks that are correlated with obesity or being overweight, that's pretty much the main one, okay? That's the one that's going to have one of the most adverse effects globally on your metabolic function, okay? All right. So, we're going to start looking at how we can relate to what's going on and how we can actually then start resolving some of these issues. So, as I said before, cortisol is your body's alarm system. If it's low in the morning, you're going to feel like shit trying to get out of bed, all right? So if this is the AM, okay, and we're on a graph here, if this is the morning and this is how high your cortisol is in the morning when you wake up, and this is AM and this is PM, basically your cortisol curve should look like this. You should wake up in the morning, high energy. Usually guys will wake up with an erection, and then you just jump out of bed, you're feeling great, you're alert, you're consciously aware, and then over the day it just kindly slowly travels down. Now, all of my clients in my consults, I actually get them to draw this on a scale of how the energy levels look and peak and dip. And to be fair, most people's look like this. Then a big spike in the afternoon, then a drop, then usually they'll kind of either plateau down or they'll kind of flatline until their head hits the pillow because they're completely exhausted. So that's what's called an irregular cortisol curve. What you want to be doing is trying to reset your metabolism so that it's the other way. High energy in the morning, low at night. The best way to think about it is like going as like a throwback to the way we were in primitive times. And we're going to talk about this in a second, but I just wanted to touch on it there. So if you're hard time falling into sleep, that's the opposite end. You're tired and wired, you're lying in bed thinking about, I don't know, the universe or questions of meaning of life or what you're going to do at work tomorrow, etc. Okay, these are people that just can't switch their brain off. That's like monkey chatter that's just going around and around and around. And also people that have anxiety issues. Anxiety is huge. And anxiety is pretty much where you've just got extremely high, you're basically running on adrenaline, okay? Because we're feeling overwhelmed and we're being flustered, okay? And always, it's almost worry, just in a constant state of worry about the future. And it's pretty much what that's doing is that's how I was. Pretty much like I was talking before, like when I was at work, I was always like on edge and in like this super hyper vigilant state. So you need to really be able to balance that and put yourself into kind of like a rest and relax state. Otherwise, like I say, you can only operate up there for too long before it's going to start crashing down on top of you. Now, your cortisol is going to affect how you respond to food. It's going to create food cravings, particularly for salt, sugar, and fat. Okay, we've actually seen that cortisol actually can alter the structure of the brain. Okay, and it will actually increase the satiety signaling from foods like fat, sugar, and salt, which tends to be everything that is delicious that everybody loves. So we tend to overeat and crave these foods more regularly. And anybody will know this, okay? So, hands up at people here who crave salt at night. Anyone? No? Cool. I used to have a client that used to eat a bag of corn chips every night before he went to bed. Couldn't work out why, I just thought he really liked corn. I was like, no, it's the salt. Okay, because he's getting at night and he's so exhausted at the end of the day, okay? And because also aldosterone, which is It helps with the reuptake of sodium and helps regulate your blood pressure. When that drops, what do people do when they're feeling low energy? They start then craving salt because it picks them back up again. Okay, kind of stimulates your adrenals to bring your cortisol back up to where it should be, so you feel alive again. But his problem was that he was eating a bag of corn chips and then he wasn't sleeping. Okay, and even once we started flipping him the other way, salt in the morning, none at night, it dramatically turned his sleep patterns on its head. So we went from being wired all night to actually being able to sleep through and actually waking up higher energy in the morning. It's correcting that cortisol curve, which I'm going to show you how to do. The sugar and fat one kind of speaks for itself. Because your adrenal glands are actually responsible for the secretion and production of a lot of hormones, fat actually provides the cell membrane for hormone production. So if you are actually putting the boot into your adrenal glands and you're always saying to your body, make more cortisol, you need to provide the substrate for that. And sugar as well. Who craves the carbs when they're stressed out? Don't lie. We all do it. Okay? No one probably wants to put their hand up. I used to self-medicate with Ben & Jerry's. Boom. Okay, high sugar, high fat, and for me, for someone that doesn't really eat that much junk and that then gets a high dose of sugar and fat in one meal like that, for me it was like crack. So if I didn't eat just like half the tub, I could easily sit down with a 2-litre tub of ice cream and I could smash it by the end of it, okay? Without even blinking an eyelid. That was my life, basically. But you've got to remember too, there's that high sugar intake and that inflammation that's combined with the high cortisol is going to dramatically, like that's where it's going to go. All my clients, when we look at our skin fold calipers as well, like until we actually begin managing and getting on top of that cortisol, we don't really see any drops in their abdominal. Very, very little. Especially if there's someone that I can see is like chronically stressed out. We start addressing it, they'll start leaning out from everywhere else, but particularly in men, that tends to be their stubborn area. And if you look at even myself on stage, this time last year, I was struggling so hard and depleting calories and the amount of cardio and training to try and get lean, and I still couldn't fully get my abs popping. Okay, but it was only once I addressed my cortisol issue and my digestion and my gut that it just happened, and it was effortless. Just quickly touching on this. Okay, this will be, I promise this is the last of all the endocrinology, okay? All right, but this is really important. So remember how I was just talking about libido, okay? And that how most people usually once they're stressed out, like their erections go out the window, okay? So they're not basically having no sexual desire whatsoever. This is the reason why. So cortisol is going to crash your hormones, particularly your sex steroid hormones, which is your testosterone and estrogen as well for females, okay? And you know, the thing is that testosterone is very heavily associated with feelings of vitality, okay? Mood, well-being, etc. So particularly in men, as soon as the testosterone levels are suboptimal, you start seeing the onset of things like muscle loss, depression, anxiety, things like that. Personally, and like I was experiencing all these things, okay? And I still actually get it from time to time if I'm really going through a hard bout of training and burning the candle at both ends. But the mechanism behind how this happens is called the pregnenolone steal. Now what that is you've got your adrenal glands which are actually making pregnenolone, and as you can see here, from here is where the tree kind of forks out and branches. So you're using the same material to produce both your sex hormones and also cortisol, okay? So basically, if you're always stressing out, you're converting your body's the signaling to produce more cortisol, and you're diverting it this way, which is then basically castrating yourself, more or less, okay? So then you don't actually have anything much left over in order to actually provide what you require to produce testosterone, okay? All right, so now let's just, we've done with all the doom and gloom, so we're gonna get back onto the fun stuff. There is light at the end of the tunnel, okay? So, as we said, cortisol is very heavily associated with sleep issues. Sleep disturbances. When I usually see a client first off the bat, and I really, really like to grill them about their sleep, because the reality is that if your sleep is shit, you're gonna feel like shit. And sleep time is when your brain is actually resting, regenerating, recovering, okay? And if you're not sleeping well, then you're not healing, you're not growing, okay? So in terms of even like training for body composition, your sleep cycles, there's so many hormonal pulses that are associated with that, such as like growth hormone, testosterone, your circadian rhythms, etc. This is why it's very important to go to bed at the same time, wake up at the same time religiously, okay? It's just so that you're always in that rhythm, that natural kind of like biorhythm. And it goes back to primitive times, waking up with the sun, going to sleep with the sun. This is why people who are shift workers tend to really find that their sleep is just like way off the charts. And they usually find it very, very hard to achieve a lot of significant changes in body composition if they don't actually manage that well and actually really make sure that that stress response is actually being managed, because it is so central. So electronics and white light, okay? Just remember that your bed is for sleep and sex. Do not take your phone to bed with you. Who does that? Don't lie. Everybody here. I know a lot of people do that. Like about trying to go to sleep and then it's like Facebooking or something, or like cycling through Instagram. Look, I do it from time to time as well, even though I know that I shouldn't. But that is a huge one. And also just piggybacking on that whole, going back to caveman times, that white light actually interferes with your melatonin secretion, okay? It's highly stimulatory to the brain. So even watching like television at night before you go to bed is probably not the best idea. I would definitely recommend low light, salt lamp, candle light, etc., rather than fluorescence. And then also read a book, do something that's relaxing, meditating. Try and like go on a bit of an information or an electronic detox, at least an hour before you go to sleep. You need to kind of like prepare your body for rest if you really want to achieve optimal sleep, okay? Now, this one is huge. Remember we were talking about the sea salt before and how it actually helps control blood pressure and stimulates the adrenal glands and actually will help help regulate your cortisol. If anyone's not already doing this, I strongly recommend this because it's something that I do with all of my clients, and I have seen great things happen in terms of just managing their stress and improving their sleep quality and just generally how they feel during the day. Also because I guess it's good to hydrate first thing in the morning, but with a squirt of lime juice in there is good for your digestion as well. That's actually like a really old practice in a lot of Ayurvedic medicine. No one wants to hear this, but caffeine intake, eliminate or restrict it. If you're finding that you're having like serious withdrawals from caffeine, if you don't have it, then you have a serious problem, and it's probably worth going on a 2 to 4 week detox to give your body a rest. And especially because people do, as soon as they feel low energy, they start to self-medicate with caffeine. You know what I mean? Like the amount, and the thing is that we're in a society where during the day we tend to wear exhaustion like a badge of, like a medal of honor. You know what I mean? Like especially, I noticed this when I was in New York, because there was everyone there. The people I stayed with were like gone. I thought I got up at the Sparrows Fart. They were out of the house before I even got up at like 6 a.m. and I would be back at like 7, 8 p.m. at night, and I would go to bed at maybe 10 when they were just getting in the door. You know what I mean? But that's kind of like the mentality of a lot of New Yorkers, is that kind of like hustle and hustle hard to get ahead. But you know what I mean? Like you can't run on caffeine forever. Your system's going to become overloaded, and if you are already at that stage where you're feeling low energy and you're using caffeine as a crutch, then that should be a telltale sign that you have a problem, okay? Is that your energy reserves are becoming depleted, okay? And rather than, leaning on coffee, you need to start looking at other methods in order to actually feed your body and actually start trying to bounce back naturally, all right? But in terms of nutrition as well, gluten and sugar, gluten has been known to trigger a molecule in the gut called zonulin, which actually increases like the barriers in your gut, which then cause food particles, etc., to leak through, kind of like what we were talking before. I'm not going to go into gluten and gluten sensitivity, etc. now, but that's just a known thing. Basically, if you can eliminate anything from your diet that's causing any type of food sensitivities, just notice how you feel. If you eat something and you feel mucousy, fatigued, brain fogged, or even then I would recommend going and getting a good food sensitivity panel done, because you might be surprised at some of the things that come out. I've had clients do them before, and quite commonly a lot of things will come out in it that they're eating all the time, not realizing that because they've gone through these periods of stress and this has happened to the gut, that they've actually made themselves intolerant to it, which is then actually adding an insult to injury. It's a very common thing. Caloric deficit, okay? Anyone that's done any type of really extreme dieting or is in a very high caloric deficit over time is going to definitely have an increase in cortisol. So we need to make sure that your macronutrient intake is balanced, okay? And that we're eating a nice, clean, whole foods diet, foods that are going to help counter inflammation, give the body what it requires. Basically, you want to eat as nutrient dense as you possibly can, okay? It's a bit of a no-brainer, But it is definitely something, because we do, especially in my line of work as well, we tend to focus more so on the calories and the macronutrients or the macros rather than actually looking at the food quality, okay, or the nutrient density of what we're eating as well. Which is part of the reason why, touching on before, I don't believe in flexible dieting, etc. Because it's kind of like, if you're replacing, how do you say, foods in your diet that are nutritionally dense for junk, then it's kind of not really doing you any favors in the long term. Carbohydrates at night, though, is very, very good. Resistant starch is also very good, providing the prebiotic fiber for your gut bacteria to help it flourish. And also, just in terms of supplementation, there's a long history of the use of herbal compounds called adaptogens in helping to balance out and buffer cortisol levels as well, which are extremely beneficial. Not going to go into that today. We could do that at a later time. But in terms of nutritional supplementation, your baseline ones that you really want to address is a multivitamin with active B vitamins, okay? Because the thing is that your adrenals, if you're under stress, are going to rapidly deplete B vitamins more so faster than anything else. Also vitamin D levels to help improve blood sugar control, and also high dose magnesium and a high quality fish oil as well, okay? Basically for brain function, and also to help calm your nervous system down, because magnesium, rather than putting you in a fight or flight mode, it's going to put you in a rest and digest mode, more of a parasympathetic state, which is why magnesium pre-bed is very, very good for helping with sleep issues. Okay. Next one, practice mindfulness. Now this is actually my favorite one. The nutritional interventions and the sleep and stuff is all very important, but I think this is the biggest thing, because I've found that from personally, my personal experience, and I'm a very big kind of self-help guy, but I've definitely found a lot of truth in changing and reframing the way that I look at things in terms of actually helping me tolerate and create stress resilience. In terms of sort of the way, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change, how you're perceiving the things that are, whether they're happening to you or happening for you, whether or not what you are experiencing you're perceiving as a challenge, or you're perceiving as something that is supporting you, that's strengthening you, that you can overcome, okay? In that split section moment where you actually take responsibility for how you feel and how you approach a situation is dramatically going to change the physiological response, okay? It's like how I was saying before, whether it's real or imagined, your body does not know the difference, okay? And this is particularly, for example, if you can think up, who has ever had something really, really painful happen to them? Some type of emotional trauma, but they can't let it go. But then even now today, when you think about it, it still winds you up. That's something that may have happened a long time ago, all right? It's not imagined, it's real, it happened. But because you haven't learned to actually be present and be able to move past that and let that go, you're still actually creating that same physiological response internally in your body as if it was still happening to you, okay? Now, looking at the Journal of Personality, Social Psychology, Gratitude, they did this with people in 3 groups. One with chronic pain. They had one group that actually they focused purely on their hassles, so things that they perceived as going wrong in their life. It was kind of like the opposite of a gratitude journal. Rather than looking at what they're grateful for, they were recording everything that they hated. But they found that it actually increased their happiness and feelings of general well-being by up to about 25%. Now, I don't need a study to tell me this, because this is something that I recommend once again with all my clients, and I know that not everybody does it, but it's something that I still like to ask everybody to do consistently, because the brain, there's a whole world and sort of a field of inquiry into neuroplasticity of the brain, which is really how the concept of how when you change the way that you think and your experiences over time, you actually change the structures of the brain. Okay, the way that you think and the way that you react to the stimulus in your environment, whether it's negative or positive, you can actually change the wiring of your brain and softwire your brain to actually have a positive reaction. So in that instant, the more that you actually begin to look around you for the things going well in your life, and you're actually looking for the positives and the blessings, then you'll be more inclined to basically look for those experiences or those positive reinforcements or those positive encounters or things that are happening to you on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't have to be anything like The Secret or metaphysical and woo-woo, because I know a lot of people go, oh, fuck off. when you start talking about that. Like, I like to look at it in terms of, it is true, it's in the way that you actually change the way you look at things. When we focus on the positives, we see more positives, okay? Perception, no-brainer. Practicing forgiveness, and this is kind of as well a big one I find in terms of that the hostility and the resentment that we tend to harbour towards other people in our life, people that we perceive in a position or in a moment to be challenging us. Okay, so I always, when I'm going through a tough time and I'm feeling like resentful and down, I always ask myself the question, which I got from Marianne Williamson, who's a spiritual thought leader, is, against whom am I still holding a grudge and where have I not forgiven? Okay, because once again, real or imagined, if it's like there's someone that you're burdening yourself with the hostility or ill will towards, it's like Buddha once said that holding anger towards another person is like swallowing poison and expecting the other person to die. Okay, but that's why I think that that's definitely a very valuable practice in terms of being able to basically find a place of peace and poise within yourself. Okay, because if we're always obsessing over the things that are winding us up, okay, then we're just kind of accelerating the issue, or we're kind of like exacerbating or throwing fuel on the fire, all right? So, prayer, meditation, deep breathing. Anyone done Kundalini yoga? Ever before? Nah? Okay, cool. Kundalini yoga I really like because it's more into the breathing. They're a bunch of kooks, no offense to anyone that's watching, because I personally love it. I think it's brilliant, but it's very much into breathing and channeling energy around the body, etc. And I find that in terms of stress management, it actually works really, really well for me. Okay, and if there's anyone heard of the field of epigenetics? So when we talk about genetics, we're basically saying that life's dealt you the hand that you were given, okay, and that your lifestyle and your cellular expression is basically based upon your genetic encoding. Epigenetics kind of takes that a little step further and more or less says, yes, that is true, but also our environment actually impacts our genetic expression as well. From the way that we think, from the way that we socialize, the company we keep, the environment, the amount of pollution that we live in, how we eat, every little itty-bitty thing that you do actually affects the way that your body actually responds at a cellular level, which I think is massive. And I definitely have to 100% agree with that. And that is why, once again, I tend to think, okay, so when we look and we tend to think, why are we as a society so stressed out, more so than we perhaps have ever been, is because we are probably living so far away from we are biologically evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to actually do so, okay? Our sleep patterns are out, our eating patterns are different, our consciousness has shifted in the way that we think, we react, the pressures of work, okay, holding down a job, financial burdens, etc. This is totally shit that, like, caveman, in the Paleolithic era did not have to deal with. All they had to worry about was having enough food and not being eaten, okay? So this is why we look at the environment as well. Toxic exposure and pollution is a huge one. There are so many things that are in our environment that we're exposed to, our body's just constantly absorbing, and can actually increase your body's cortisol response. Very, very easy to get tested for heavy metal testing or hair mineral analysis. That'll give you a great insight into basically how well you're detoxifying as well, or able to actually eliminate these compounds from your body. But there's so much research that's shown things like cognitive and mood disorders, etc., and metabolic disorders that are associated with heavy metal burden. Other than that, guys, spend more time outside, get fresh air. Strength training over cardio, long duration. Chronic cardio is going to definitely jack up your cortisol. Strength training, there was a meta-analysis I just saw released this morning that was showing dramatic reductions in anxiety in people with anxiety, and even more so in healthy participants. Get natural light, get outside, take off your shoes, get out in nature. And also oxytocin, which is pretty much like the lovey-dovey hugging hormone. It's also the hormone that's released when you hug someone, that's also released after orgasm as well. This is a big antidote to stress. As we were saying before, those feelings of isolation and loneliness, and feeling disconnected, not feeling valued, feeling unworthy, are absolutely detrimental to your psychology and hence your physiology. So what my recommendation is to spend more time with the people that you love and devote time to it. Make sure you make time. If there's people in your life that, for example, that you don't talk to often, like your family, like tell people that you love them. Like I'm very big on that. I have friends that are like down in they'll be like down in Melbourne and I haven't seen them in ages, and you know what, first I started doing it with them, like they'd hang up the phone and be like, oh yeah, okay, talk to you later, yeah, I love you, bye. And at first they're like, oh yeah, bye. But now they all say it like it's a very like a please and thank you thing, and it's actually helped me to actually create stronger bonds with these people. So even then when I'm going through a period of acute stress and I feel that I'm maybe a little bit isolated, you know, I actually have people I know that are everywhere where I still feel connected to, that I know that I can turn to if I'm ever really feeling down or I need to vent. And that has a dramatic impact on your psychology. Anybody can attest to that. And also be selfish. Stop saying yes to shit that you hate. Don't do stuff that you don't want to do. How many times do we bump into someone that we haven't seen for ages and they're just like, oh hey man, you're looking really well, yeah sick, let's catch up for a coffee. That would be awesome. And then as soon as they turn around, you're just like, fuck, how am I going to get out of this? You know what I mean? But you've already kind of put your foot in it, okay? And then you're going to probably spend the next week creating nervous anxiety around how the fuck am I going to get out of this one? You know what I mean? So I think that's definitely a huge thing as well for a lot of us, because I think we tend to have a problem where we're kind of scared to say no, whether it's to people and it's usually the hardest to say no to people that we love, I think, but also to, for example, your employers, your boss, especially if you're in a position of responsibility and you've got someone above you that keeps snowballing and throwing and putting stuff on you, and you know, we try to take everything on and we don't want to delegate because we don't want to seem incompetent, you know what I mean? But if you just keep saying yes, 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 you got to remember that you're going to pay for it sooner or later, and that you are only human, and that sometimes it is necessary to be able to actually push back in order to actually achieve more and get more done. Okay? So, what I'm planning to do with you guys, I actually wanted to put together a handout, but that just didn't happen. Okay? So I apologize for that, but what I am going to do is I'm going to put together a brief summary of what we've talked about today, and I'm going to put it up on my Facebook business page that you guys can download, based around mainly like the practical steps that you can actually implement that we've just talked about in order to actually help get yourself back on track if you feel like you might be at the beginning or caught somewhere in that kind of downward spiral. But I also want to organise to do next week on the Friday at 7 o'clock, do another Q&A, just like a live webinar online, where you can then jump in, you can ask questions, we can talk about, you know, how you may have reflected on what you've learned, and basically then see how you've implemented it. Okay, what changes are you prepared to make, or is there something that you would like to add or you would like to know more about? Feel free to drop me a direct message, and I'll definitely make sure that I bring that up as another topic that we talk about. Okay? Cool. So thank you very much for your time, guys. I'm going to hang around for a couple of minutes, so if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.